Thank you very much, Michael, for the introduction, which has queued up quite a few of the things that I'm going to be talking about. So I had a very broad brief in the opening talk of this event, and actually what I'm going to talk about has been incrementally changing during the extremely busy month of January. I've been braving the snows in all directions. Virtually every event I've been to, there's been about half a dozen since Christmas, has been on the subject of new data. And it's really very, very much a boiling topic at the moment. It's quite clear from these conversations, and the conversations involve different people to the ones I would be normally talking to about research data in the commercial sector, virtually every sector in fact, but particularly in the commercial sector as a new colleagues who have their hands on live data streams. And it's quite clear that this is going to have a transformative effect on the way that we do social science, what social science means, and the role of the social scientist in relation to data and policy. Okay, so I'm going to start with a disclosure here, and I'll have more to talk about the topic of disclosure later on. I am a faint-hearted singletarian, and for those people who don't know what a singletarian is, it's a form of research which is studying the relationship between computers and humans, with the view that in some point in the future the two things will merge together, right? The humans and computers will become one thing. It sounds like a bizarre notion, and there's plenty of bizarre people involved in that movement, but there are some very well thought of academics as well. I'm faint-hearted because I don't really like the idea, whereas quite a lot of the singletarians are quite keen on it. But what it expresses as a concept is our relationships with computers, with IT, with the web, and with data as a critical part of that relationship are becoming more and more intimate. And this has been reflected in a process that's gone on over a long period of time. This is not something that's happening just now. Data has been increasing in volume, in complexity, in the range of types over a long period of time. I mean, we're talking since the beginning of the 20th century. This increase in all of these dimensions, complexity, scope, volume, etc., is exponentially increasing. And there's dramatic changes in the scope of data for all purposes, social policy purposes, research purposes, and so on. But social data for social research is no exception. What we've also seen in the last 15 years is an explosion of different types of data controllers, people with their hands on social data, using it for some purpose or other. We've seen an explosion of social media data growth and an explosion of commercial data, and commercial data being used for secondary purposes, not just as transactions. Last week, Telefonica released their Smart Steps product, service in fact, Smart Steps service. This is another interesting feature of this, that we no longer can think about it quite in the same way. The idea of a data product as the end point of a process seems to become a bit out of date itself when we're talking about something that's happening continuously. So a data service or a data stream is a more appropriate language. Yes, so last week their service, the Smart Step service, went up and running. So this is essentially tracking data from mobile phones, from O2's mobile phone service. I'm sure you're aware that as you walk around the world, if you've got a mobile phone, it's constantly pinging the towers that you're going past and relaying your location back to your mobile phone provider, who keeps that information in a database, and therefore this is obviously valuable social information, and now you can buy access to that service. and obviously there's all sorts of implications for that, which are an interesting point of conversation just on their own. The other aspect of the current climate is linkage. Linkage is, again, a very, very important topic. Different data are being linked together that were previously not associated, and there are whole new methodologies developing for combining, enhancing, fusing, linking, various languages used here, but the idea is basically we're joining data together that was previously separate. And this is kind of all summarised up by this concept of big data. An interesting point about working interdisciplinary here, there's a little thing over there called a zettabyte. And what I do is work in interdisciplinary environments, and I asked one of my computer science colleagues what a zettabyte actually was, and he said, well, it's 1,000 exabytes, and I thought, yeah, that doesn't really help me. Turns out it's a trillion gigabytes. This idea of big data is one of these terms that's been coined and then had a life of its own, and I think this word cloud kind of gets at the idea that this is a complex form of different data being brought together and used in a flexible way. And it may be qualitative and quantitative data being combined. It certainly refers to the idea of real data, and it turns to data in lots of different forms. Open data. So this is another feature of the current environment, which again will have a really strong impact on the relationship between social science and the rest of society, and who is doing social science. I showed this slide to colleagues at the Open Data Institute, and they said, oh yeah, can we have that button? So the idea that there's this pressure to make data available, and that's all data, and potentially data then could be used by anybody who's interested in doing research or any other activity which is data focused. And this again obviously changes who is doing social science and how it's being done. And focusing more on the topic of this particular event, data is increasingly live. And live data has, again, a whole other dimension which has massive implications for how we're doing research, who's doing the research, what sort of skills are required to do the research. And that in itself is you could have a whole conference just on those particular topics. Now, we put all these processes together, only a little leap is required, where you start to think perhaps about a different sort of thing, and I hinted at it earlier on. Rather than thinking about data sets and databases, it may become more appropriate to use languages like data layers, where you imagine that there's a whole range of human activity at various levels of scale, and over the top of that is this data layer, which is more or less synchronized with the actual activity. That's, in a sense, the notion of big live data. And geographers are used to this. This is a representation of a state of the US. I can't remember which one. If there's a geographer in the room, I'm sure they can tell me. But here we've got different representations, different layers. And that's a kind of current idea that people who use GIS systems are quite comfortable with and use. Now, I think that when we start to think about big data going forward, it won't look like this, it will look more like this. And this expresses the idea of interconnectivity of data on many different levels and many different relationships being expressed. So relationships between people in networks, relationships between levels of analysis, relationships between different data. So different data recalling and connecting to a particular individual with different expressions of maybe the same underlying concept. And as social scientists, that's one of the things where we can bring contributions to this new social science milieu because we have obviously spent a lot of time thinking about those issues, how data represents people and people's activities. Analysing this data layer, which has also been called Web 3.0, Tim Berners-Lee famously called it the web of linked data. And somebody in the audience, I think it was an audacious PhD student, said, is that a prediction or is it a statement of intent? And the analysing data in that context, which I think is a reasonable prediction, even if it's not a statement of intent by Tim, is clearly a significant challenge. Analysing data well is a very significant challenge. How do you account when you're thinking about the data, in the links between different pieces of data regarding the same individual or regarding different individuals? How do you account for contradictions? So you're having multiple streams of data, as indeed will become the norm. You've got redundancy in your data system. How do you account for the contradictions? How do you resolve the contradictions between what different data streams are telling you about a particular individual data point level of analysis? What does sampling mean in this concept? Do we even need sampling? That's a very important question, particularly for the quantitative analysts. Now, it might be that we need a completely different framework, a completely different thing to think about. If you think about this slide here, it's impossible to think in terms of analysing this complexity of data in terms of traditional methods. It just don't mean anything. And this is just a representation, but it represents the complexity that we're talking about. And if we're going to harness that complexity to make useful social policy decisions, to do useful social research, then we're going to need a completely different framework. And it might have more in common with visual image processing than orthodox data analysis. And we might need to refer to those types of methodologies within computer science and artificial intelligence, where complex images are analysed for patterns. This isn't a theory, by the way, before anybody shoots me down on this. It's just a piece of expository fluff in some way. But the point is to make a point about how a process is changing. Now, we can imagine that a relationship between research and society, particularly social science research and society, runs roughly, there are some data captured in whatever way they're captured. We run some sort of analysis, this leads to some research findings, and as we're all engaged in at the moment, that research finding leads to some impact, which leads to a change in policy, procedures, operations, in some way or other, and that in turn leads to a change in behaviour, which produces new data. Now, the point about live data is that this circle, this relationship between research and analysis becomes much more compacted. It's much tighter. Because the data is arriving in real time. If your research process is in tune with that, then your research process is happening in real time as well. And the idea of policy may itself have to change in the context of this. What does policy making mean in the context of real-time data streams? Again, that's something that the political community is really only just starting to think about. Now, a problem with this is was captured when I showed this to an engineering colleague, and said, "Yeah, that sounds exactly like a control loop." So a certain group of academic thought would understand this diagram, taking the words out and just thinking about the mechanism as a control system. And indeed, you could say that's exactly what is happening here. We've got information, we're analysing the information, and we're changing the system in some way in response to that analysis, and that in turn leads to a change in the information. So that is a pretty well-defined control system. Now, control system obviously means something very different in a social political context and therefore we have to have at least some concern and maybe some real strong ethical analysis about what this all means. And again, this is an important role that social scientists can play, looking at from above the actual data research policy process, as well as getting involved in what's going on with the data and actually analysing the data as well. So, and I'll come back to that later. So, I would argue then that we're at a social ethical turning point, and this Dilbert cartoon actually expresses this really well. Suddenly we're able to do stuff that we weren't able to do before, but actually the implications of doing that stuff are quite significant. And one of the key points of this is the ethical consequences in terms of issues like access and ownership, who owns the data, who can use the data. There are obvious implications which I'll go to in a little more detail regarding confidentiality and privacy, and there's complete lack of clarity in our current data protection laws. They are not fit for the purpose of dealing with the sorts of data that we're talking about here. And so we may need new best practice, new forms of consent, and one of my many hats is that I'm involved in the UK Anonymisation Network, which is thinking about a lot of these issues, both with current and indeed new data. Now, privacy, which is at the core of these considerations, is still important. Now, there's always a question, and if you go to an audience of information scientists, certainly within the sort of big EU political context, there's always this underlying question that privacy is not important anymore. And there's a famous saying by an American theorist whose name escapes me for some reason at the moment, privacy is dead, get over it. Now, clearly as a concern it is not, and I could have put hundreds of different graphics up here. This is just one I've plucked off the web. It's the importance of privacy for mobile phone users. Now, there's a big question, which again is a subject to debate in this area, as to the connection between people's stated beliefs about privacy and desires and their actual behaviour. But nevertheless, we can't deny that it's still important. One of the issues that causes a lot of confusion in this area is the representation of privacy as the concept of secrecy, the alignment of those two things. And this is a misunderstanding of what privacy is and what it means and what it always has done. And actually clarity about what privacy is will help us to understand what it is that we need to be maintaining or even improving, whereas if we have lack of clarity about it, then we won't know even if we have or don't have it. Okay, so this is a very old, this is not a new quote, this is nearly 50 years old now from Rachel's, but I think it really sums up an important aspect of privacy which helps to understand what it is we're trying to preserve. So there's a close connection between our ability to control who has access to our information and our ability to create and maintain different sorts of social relationships with different people. So the notion of control and relationships and the ability to decide what's happening and who has access to our information. And those verbs are the critical things. So disclosure, so the control process in an individual level is a mechanism by which we operate our privacy. We decide who learns what information about us. And that's sort of the fundamental idea. And this is why non-consensual disclosure, which is essentially other people using your information, disseminating your information without your consent, is so problematic. That disclosure is a critical psychological process. It's one by which we define our relationships. And non-consensual disclosure subverts that process. So it has a really important social psychological effect. So amongst that, we have this relationship between privacy and identity. Privacy is part of the mechanism by which I control my relationships, and that's critical to the formation of my identities. I'm going to pass over that slide. And we can refer to social theorists like Goffman and Mead to kind of triangulate this. So identity is represented to others through self-disclosure, as Goffman. Identity is formed through our interactions with others and their representations to us, that's Mead. So that again reflects that idea that disclosure of information, disclosure of myself is part of those relationships. It forms those relationships and is then critical to the formation of my identity. So if we change that process, we'll be changing this process as well. So changes in what we do about personal information are critical to these fundamental social processes. Privacy at its root concerns personhood. Now, there's a critical point here of cultural specificity. Now, I'm obviously coming from a liberal Western viewpoint here. I have a very particular view of privacy to do with the culture I've been brought up in. And the actual interpretation of this is obviously culturally dependent. But I would maintain that how privacy is interpreted is exactly reflected in variations in these other ideas as well. So the importance of centrality of privacy, the importance of control over one's data is also related to ideas of locus control and autonomy. So in a culture where those things are not as highly valued, one will find that privacy as well is not as highly valued. But the mechanism, the underlying mechanism is similar. Similarly, where in cultures where identity is more diffuse, identity is something which is associated with communities, villages, families in a much more, much stronger way than perhaps is generally true in the West, and particularly in the Teutonic countries. One would kind of apply these processes at that level. And it's certainly the idea of group disclosure and group identity and a group locus of control is entirely in keeping here. So this is just a trigram that I'm basically maintaining that it's impossible to understand these concepts, identity, disclosure and privacy, in isolation. They all are important in the understanding of each other's. I therefore would argue that our data and ourselves are intrinsically entwined, weaving back now to the topic of the day. So what happens in the data layer will have a transformative effect on how we think about ourselves as individuals and collectively. And therefore, a sociology of data, social science of data, social theory of data is paramount. So again, another challenge to social science here is to think reflexively about the relationship between ourselves and our data. Here's some questions that one might think of as social science research questions. How does data impact on how we view ourselves, our identity and our society? And at a very, very broad brush level, that's the topic that I've just been talking about. How do our attitudes affect how we view our data? How does our data impact on our norms, attitudes and values? So how does the relationship between ourselves and our data, and how the sorts of data that we're using and collecting and how it's used, will impact upon these important social psychological concepts? I suggest here that informational privacy is a really key contact point between digital and social identities. Now, the changes in that will cause changes in what that relationship means, in a sense, who we are. So broadly under the heading of our data, our society. Now I mentioned this word control processes again. How do control processes for data reflect the existing social structures? And how do they inform the social structures and how do they transform the social structures? So again, as a society, we need to be aware that we are not simply now setting up information systems. We are setting up social systems, and the relationship between those two is complex and transformative on relatively short time scales. How is data shaped by institutions and the objectives that produce them? So institutions have purposes, they collect data for purposes, those data are representations, but those representations are affected by the institutions that collected them and the purposes for which they've been collected. And how does that affect then the outcomes in terms of any analytical process that you might carry out? And this issue has already been explored to some extent in the context of using administrative data for research. What are the main sources of data outside of the academy, how they're used already, and how does ownership affect their use? Related. How does social science engage with those data? So going on to the research context, how do we define data in the social sciences? Is this time for a step back and think about, okay, what is information for which we can do social science? Can social science adapt to use any form of data? Is it this fluid object, or actually is social science defined by the data that we use? And are we looking at a whole new idea about doing research which actually doesn't have a place for social science? Can a meaningful data ontology be developed? Can we express the idea of what data means and its social context through an ontology? What is big data exactly? And actually, so this is always a question. It's of course a buzzword, and it'll get applied to all sorts of things. So again, is there something significant here? And what's the defining features which says, right, this is now big data because this can happen with it, or this is happening with it? And that's the defining feature of big data. It's not just a label we're going to apply to anything that looks like it might be a bit chunky. So there's a question, are these transformative? I mean, I've expressed an opinion on that. I clearly think they are, and this will be a really significant period, both in our society and in our science. And where are data now providing new departures in the social sciences? So again, this all relates to this transformative effect. And one question actually that's arisen, and this is again, if you're interacting with engineers and scientists as I do, this question arises, which from a social science point of view is actually quite surprising, but it does, I think, actually asking this question does make us think about what it is we need. What does social sciences need to do in the current environment? So does the ubiquitous data affect the centrality of theory? So so I have an engineering colleague who said, well, surely we don't need theory anymore. We've got so much data, we just need to build a good model. Now, clearly, you may have gathered from my viewpoint, actually the opposite is true. We need different new theory, but we certainly actually need theory above all else in terms of what is important in terms of understanding how this new data is going to affect the way that we do things on all levels. Okay, so to conclude, analysing the data layer, Web 3.0 is a serious challenge. Retaining functioning privacy in a world of linked data is a really significant challenge. I believe this is possible to do, but it will require significant research efforts and policy will. And in both cases, so both on the side of the politic body and the research body, we will need to let go of old frameworks, old methods, old ideas, and be flexible and agile. Thank you very much.